Something does not sit right. Why are they considered sacred? You would think that answer should come easily. Some things are treated with reverence, and after a while, that feeling starts to seem natural, almost obvious, as if it was always there, as if everyone around it simply understood what it was supposed to mean. And maybe that is enough at first. Maybe it feels like one of those things you do not need to question too closely. People call something sacred, and the word itself seems to settle everything. But then something does not stay settled. Because the closer you look, the less that word seems to hold in one place. It is still there. People still use it. They still act as if it belongs. But there is something underneath it that does not line up with the feeling you expect to find. Not loudly. Not all at once. Just enough to make the label feel heavier than it should. Older, maybe. Or thinner. As if it has been covering something for a very long time without fully containing it. And once that starts to register, the simple answer stops feeling complete. The reverence is still there. The name is still there. But whatever makes them sacred does not sit as neatly as it seems it should. So why are they considered sacred? At first, the answer seems to be standing in plain view. A wide plaza opens beneath an exposed band of limestone, and the wall above it receives everything that marks a sacred remnant. Rows of bodies turn toward it, whispered prayer, mourning, folded notes pressed into narrow seams. The stones are not treated as ordinary old masonry. They are approached as surviving matter from the place where the temple once stood, the last reachable substance of the holiest site in Jewish memory. That explanation fits the visible behavior almost too neatly. If the temple is gone, and these blocks remain at its edge, then reverence settles on the blocks. The setting reinforces it. The raised platform of the Temple Mount stands above the prayer area. The wall is not isolated in some museum condition. It sits directly below the mount associated with the first and second temples. Pilgrimage and lament gather here, not at random ancient ruins elsewhere in the city. The stones appear to inherit sanctity from location and memory together. That seems sufficient. Then the wall itself starts asking for closer description. The exposed face is made of massive blocks, weathered but still sharply horizontal, and the people beneath them look reduced in scale. The cracks are narrow, the course is long, the stonework deliberate. Sacredness now seems to gain a more material basis, not just memory attached to a place, but actual surviving fabric from the temple complex. If these are original blocks from the ancient mount, then prayer is directed not merely toward where the temple once was, but towards stones that belong to it. That explanation becomes stronger, the longer the eye stays on the lower courses. The blocks are huge, older looking, more imposing than the masonry above. Their weight and finish suggest antiquity of a special order. The wall does not look like a symbolic substitute. It looks like survival. But survival of what, exactly? The plaza lies below an outer face, while the mount extends upward and inward beyond it. The visible stones stand at the edge of the elevated platform, not in the middle of it. Black-clad mourners sit near the base of the wall, yet no exposed sanctuary wall rises anywhere in front of them. The sacred center remembered in prayer was not at the outer edge. It stood farther inside. If these blocks are the nearest visible remains, are they revered because they were part of the sanctuary itself, or because they mark the precinct that held it? That distinction is easy to ignore from the plaza. The language of devotion tends to compress everything into temple stones. The physical arrangement does not. One surface is exposed and reachable. The lost inner structure is not. The wall receives grief because it remains available. But availability is not the same thing as identity. So the question narrows rather than clears. Are these stones sacred because they are remnants of the temple? Because they belong to the mount that enclosed it? Or because centuries of prayer have fixed holiness onto the only ancient face left open to touch and sight? The notes in the joints, the repeated lament, the orientation of the crowd all point one way. The wall's placement at the outer retaining edge points another. And the stones themselves, silent and massive, do not yet separate memory from structure. At first, the answer seems to sit in plain view at the base of the wall. The lowest courses are not ordinary rubble or later patchwork. They run in long, straight lines of enormous limestone blocks, each face framed by a drafted margin and a slightly raised center, the masonry style repeatedly associated with Herod's rebuilding works. In the plaza, the scale does part of the argument by itself. People stand beneath stones so large that the blocks seem less assembled than in place. If these are Herodian, and if Herod expanded the temple complex, then the sacredness appears to have a material anchor. These are not just old stones near a holy place. They are surviving stones from the temple platform itself. That explanation gains weight underground. In the tunnel, away from the open plaza and modern repairs, the same masonry continues in dim light. The same drafted margins, the same oversized blocks, the same disciplined horizontal run. The continuity matters. It suggests a planned monumental construction, rather than a later devotional fiction, attached to random remains. Historical accounts of Herod's expansion describe immense building operations on the mount. Here, the wall seems to preserve exactly that scale in stone. The veneration focused on these ancient courses begins to look less symbolic than evidentiary. People pray here because these blocks are genuinely temple-age fabric. But then the eye keeps climbing. Above the giant dressed stones sit smaller, rougher courses. Their texture changes. Their proportions change. Their finish changes. The lower line feels imperial. The upper wall feels accumulated. If sacredness is being drawn from identifiable Herodian masonry, where exactly does that boundary run? The plaza does not stop at the drafted margins. Attention rises across the whole visible face. Notes are inserted wherever joints allow. The reverence does not sort blocks by tooling. That might be dismissed as later habit if the lower courses alone carried the real claim. Yet, the lower courses themselves raise another procedural problem. They are described as part of the expanded temple platform. Platform, not sanctuary. The distinction is easy to ignore while standing before stones this old and this large, but the wording matters. A platform supports. A sanctuary houses. If these blocks belong to the retaining system of Herod's enlargement, then their holiness is being inferred through inclusion in the temple complex, not through direct survival from the shrine at its center. Still, the physical evidence keeps pressing in favor of the stronger claim. The masonry is not vaguely ancient. It is recognizably Herodian. The lower courses are not isolated fragments. They continue for long stretches. The wall is not a medieval invention of memory. It preserves first-century construction on a monumental scale. That seems enough to explain why these stones are treated as sacred. Then another detail intrudes from the very scene that seemed to settle it. The most visually persuasive stones are the lowest exposed ones, and the long underground continuation. Massive, ancient, unmistakable. But the sacred attention in the plaza is not confined to what can be securely dated by style. It spreads upward into later fabric without hesitation. If the explanation rests on Herodian identity alone, why does devotion ignore the masonry break? And if the explanation rests on the temple platform, what exactly is being revered here? The age of the blocks, their role in Herod's construction, or their nearness to something no longer visible at all? At first, the answer seems to sit in plain view. The prayer area presses directly against the exposed stones, and the wall itself rises from the edge of the platform, associated with the temple mount. If these are the surviving temple stones, then their sacredness needs no further argument. The location appears to settle it. Then the ground line interferes. In the exposed cuts beside the plaza, the masonry does not behave like the wall of a freestanding chamber. It drops downward in long buried courses, holding back fill. The face continues below the present surface like a retaining structure, not the side of an inner shrine. That detail is hard to ignore once seen. A sanctuary wall encloses a building. This wall restrains a massive earthen platform above it. So the question narrows. If the stones are sacred because they belong to the temple, what exactly did they belong to? The visible arrangement offers a provisional answer. The prayer area lies outside. The broad mount extends inward far beyond the wall. Farther inside the enclosure stands the dome of the rock, occupying ground much closer to where the sanctuary is usually placed. The geometry is difficult to compress. The exposed wall, is at the perimeter. The holiest structure stood deeper within. That makes the revered stones intelligible in a different way. Not as blocks from the sanctuary itself, but as surviving fabric from the expanded sacred platform that carried it. For a moment, that seems to explain everything. The stones remain sacred because they are still temple period masonry from the temple precinct. The distinction is technical, not devotional. Platform rather than shrine, enclosure rather than inner house. But the visible plaza keeps producing an awkward absence. No freestanding sanctuary wall appears anywhere in the exposed area. No fallen line of shrine masonry interrupts the open space. No accessible remnant marks the exact outer face of the building once imagined in popular memory. If the sanctuary stood farther inward, then the stones before which people gather are not simply displaced fragments of that lost structure. They are the nearest exposed edge of something larger. That raises a more exact problem. How far can sacredness travel through architecture? Across a building? Across a court? Across an enclosing platform? The retaining wall itself sharpens the issue. Its function was structural. It defined and supported the elevated compound. It did not form the inner chamber where sacrifice occurred, or where the Holy of Holies once stood, yet its placement was not incidental. It fixed the boundary of the mount, held the courts in place, and made the precinct physically possible. Remove it, and the sacred topography changes with it. The old assumption returns in altered form. Perhaps the stones are revered, not because they are sanctuary stones in the narrow sense, but because they are surviving stones of the consecrated complex. That would fit the wall's position at the outer edge, and the sanctuary's likely position farther inward. Still, one detail remains unsettled in the plaza itself. People face this wall, not just any surviving edge of the mount. If boundary alone explains the reverence, why this exposed line of masonry? And why with such concentration here? The retaining face answers part of the question. The missing sanctuary answers another part. But the concentration of sacred attention at these particular stones is still waiting for something more. At first, the answer seems to sit in plain view of the masonry itself. The exposed wall is not a stray remnant too. It runs as a perimeter, a broad enclosure line holding up the elevated platform above the lower city. From below, the stone face reads less like the side of a room than the edge of a precinct. That matters. If the sanctuary once stood farther inward, then the sacredness attached to these blocks would not depend on their having formed the shrine's own walls. It would rest on something larger, the holiness of the entire temple complex, spread across courts, gates, and graded zones of access. The topography supports that reading. Stone steps and gate lines rise toward the mount in stages. The elevation is not incidental. It organizes approach. Outer space, then inner space, then more restricted ground beyond. A retaining wall at the edge of that system is not merely structural. It fixes the boundary of consecrated terrain. The visible stones become the nearest surviving line of contact with the sacred enclosure itself. That would explain why reverence gathers here, even if no sanctuary masonry stands exposed in the plaza. Rabbinic memory, after the destruction, seems to fit the same geometry. Reverence persists for the site, not only for a vanished chamber. If holiness extended through the courts and enclosure, then a surviving boundary wall could carry that charge forward. The explanation feels solid because it accounts for both the archaeology and the devotion. The wall is sacred because it defined the sacred compound. Then the distances begin to matter. The enclosure is large, very large. If boundary alone confers sacred force, why does one exposed stretch draw concentrated prayer, while other surviving edges of the same platform do not gather equal devotion? The retaining function is shared. The perimeter logic is shared, yet the devotional intensity is not evenly distributed around the mount. The vertical arrangement adds another difficulty. Worshippers gather at the outer wall, while the inner precinct remains beyond and above the enclosure. The wall marks separation as much as nearness. It is a limit, not an entry. If sanctity radiates through the whole compound, how close is this face to the former center in practical terms? Close enough to inherit holiness, perhaps? But then why do records repeatedly single out this side, this exposure, this approach? The gates complicate it further. Steps and passage routes once led upward through successive court levels, but the visible prayer area stands outside that ascending sequence. It faces the enclosure from below rather than participating in the graded movement inward. A boundary can define sacred space, yes, but a boundary also keeps the observer out. That makes the reverence intelligible. It does not yet explain its concentration. And there's another pressure in the stone arrangement itself. The wall's significance seems tied not just to being part of the enclosure, but to being the accessible edge of it. Accessible when inner areas were not. Reachable when the sanctuary was gone. If so, the sacredness may not come from boundary alone. The physical line of the precinct explains why these stones matter. It does not yet explain why these particular stones became the place where memory kept returning. At first, the answer seems to sit on the surface. The stones themselves look used as sacred things are used. Near head height, the lower courses are darkened and polished in irregular patches, not by weather alone, but by repeated nearness over a long span. Thousands of folded notes protrude from joints across the wall face. At night, the plaza gathers its own equipment of continuity. Candles, prayer books, plastic chairs left in rows beneath the same masonry. If the question is why these stones are considered sacred, the visible record offers a practical reply. Because generation after generation has treated this exact face as the place to bring grief, petition, and memory. That explanation gains weight when the present surface is set beside older images. In black and white photographs, earlier crowds press toward the same courses. The clothing changes, the paving changes, the width of the open area changes, but the stone line does not. Witness accounts from medieval and Ottoman periods describe Jews coming to this wall to weep for the destroyed temple. The site keeps reappearing in records, not as one ruin among many, but as the reachable remnant. Sacredness, then, seems to accumulate materially. The wall survives. Prayer returns to it. The return itself becomes evidence, but the wall face complicates that neat sequence. The polished areas cluster where people can reach. The notes fill cracks that happen to be open now. Plastic chairs and electric light belong to a recent arrangement of access. If repeated use explains sacredness, why this wall, and not every old stone on the mount? Other ancient masonry survives in the enclosure. Not every exposed block has become dense with notes, witness accounts, and fixed lamenta. The photographs sharpen that problem instead of easing it. They do not merely show devotion. They show persistence of location. Crowds are not distributed across the broader platform. They are compressed before these courses. The question shifts from whether prayer can intensify sanctity to why centuries of prayer kept selecting this same vertical strip of stone. The physical condition of the wall suggests one answer. These lower blocks are the oldest visible and the most massive. Their scale unlike ordinary, later rebuilding. They stand as the nearest exposed masonry associated with the lost temple precinct. If the sanctuary itself is gone and inaccessible, the most ancient reachable edge would naturally gather memory. The worn patches would then be secondary marks, not the source of holiness but the residue of people recognizing an already privileged remnant. Yet, the surface still resists settling there. The notes are not confined to the oldest blocks. Reverence spreads across joints and faces without much regard for chronology. The darkened areas do not map neatly onto a historian's distinction between original fabric and later repair. The records preserve continuity of prayer, but continuity of masonry is less simple. Some stones are ancient platform blocks. Some visible sections belong to later rebuilding. The devotional field ignores boundaries the masonry itself presents so the wall keeps two kinds of evidence at once. One is structural. Surviving stone nearest the vanished center. The other is cumulative. Centuries of directed mourning fixed to the same place until the place itself became inseparable from the act. The notes, the polished patches, the old photographs, the night rows of chairs all make that second layer visible. But they also leave a harder question in place. If sacredness here comes from survival, plus repeated return, where exactly does one end and the other begin? At first glance, The answer seems to sit in plain view on the wall itself. The lowest courses are made of enormous smooth blocks, each face carefully dressed, each margin cut in the style associated with Herodian construction. Above them, the masonry changes. The stones become smaller. Their surfaces roughen. Joint lines drift. Color shifts from pale cream to darker bands. If sacredness comes from surviving Temple-age fabric, then the explanation appears manageable. The holiness belongs to the giant lower stones, the ones most plausibly tied to the expanded platform of the late Second Temple. That would account for the attention given to the base. It would fit the historical sequence. It would also fit the eye. The oldest-looking masonry carries the greatest weight, literally and chronologically. But the visible wall does not stop where the Herodian work stops. Higher up, rebuilt sections interrupt the older courses with later rectangular blocks. Some stretches belong to Islamic repairs, some to Ottoman rebuilding. Some include reused material set into a face already altered more than once. The wall presents itself not as a single surviving surface from one age, but as a vertical accumulation of repairs, substitutions, and continuities. If sacredness attaches only to first-century stone, where exactly does it end? At a horizontal seam? At a change in tooling? At the first reused block? The plaza offers no such boundary. Prayer extends across the full, exposed height. Notes are pressed into joints without regard for date. Bodies align toward the entire face, not toward a marked archaeological strip. The eye can separate the masonry into periods. Devotion does not visibly do the same. Perhaps that only means practice is imprecise, while the underlying reason remains precise. The lower courses could still be the true focus, with later stones merely included because they stand above them in one continuous wall. That seems workable, until the fabric is examined more closely. Different bands do not simply stack in clean historical order. Repairs cut across earlier lines. Replacement stones interrupt older runs. Spolia complicates the surface. A block may be later in placement, but earlier in origin. Another may be ancient in appearance but not in original position. The wall's age is not arranged in a single readable ascent from old to new. Then the question changes shape. If the sacredness depends on direct temple-age material, how much continuity is enough when the visible face has been patched, rebuilt, and reassembled? And if continuity of place matters more than continuity of stone, why do the massive lower courses still carry such explanatory force in every description of the site? The lower stones remain difficult to ignore. They anchor the wall physically and historically. They are the clearest surviving masonry from the temple precinct. Yet the reverence visible in the plaza spreads upward over unequal fabric, over stones that do not all belong to the same century, perhaps not even to the same building campaign. The wall is treated as one surface, while its material history refuses to be one history. So the investigation cannot stop at identifying which blocks are Herodian. The sacredness being observed is wider than the dating. The masonry itself keeps forcing that point. Ancient foundation, later repair, reused stone, uninterrupted attention. The question is no longer only which stones came from the Temple age, but why stones that did not are gathered into the same field of reverence. At first glance, the answer seems to sit in plain view. The lowest courses of the wall are made of enormous drafted margin blocks, the kind associated with Herod's expansion of the Temple Mount. They run in a straight line beneath later repairs, and they continue underground in the same style, as if the visible plaza had only uncovered the upper edge of something much larger. If these are surviving stones from the Temple age, and if almost nothing else from that world remains exposed, then the reverence looks easy to account for. Sacredness would cling to survival. That explanation holds while the eye stays low on the giant ashlar faces and their unmistakable workmanship. But the wall does not remain Herodian all the way up. Smaller rebuilt courses interrupt the ancient fabric. Different colors divide the surface into horizontal bands. Some sections belong to later Islamic and Ottoman repair. Yet the notes are pressed into joints across old and newer stone alike. And the lines of worshippers do not stop where the masonry changes date. If age alone governs sanctity, why does devotion spread without visible discrimination? The wall's position offers a stronger answer. It stands below the elevated mount, the nearest exposed masonry to the place where the sanctuary once stood. The lost center is not here, but above and inward, beyond the visible edge. From the plaza, this wall is the accessible limit of approach. That would explain why prayer fixes on it rather than on other ancient blocks elsewhere. Not because every stone belonged to the sanctuary building itself, but because this face marks the surviving boundary nearest the vanished holy core. For a moment, that arrangement fits almost everything. The lower city ends here. The retaining wall rises as the edge of the raised sacred compound. The inner platform remains beyond it. Holiness would attach to adjacency, to enclosure, to the last reachable line before the absent center. Then the surface itself complicates the picture. The polished patches near head height are not archaeological features, but accumulations of repeated presence. Old photographs show crowds pressed against the same courses, long before the modern plaza took its present form. Medieval and Ottoman accounts place Jewish prayer here over centuries. The wall is not only near the remembered sanctuary, it has also become the place where memory repeatedly settled. The notes in the joints, the worn stone, the nightly rows of prayer books and chairs below the floodlit face. These are not remnants of the temple period, yet they are part of what now makes the wall feel untouchably charged. Still, even that does not close the question. Other stones on the mount are older than some visible here, and receive nothing like the same attention. Some blocks now revered were inserted long after the temple's destruction. The sacred focus remains continuous across unequal material, as though chronology matters intensely and not enough. The ancient lower stones anchor the claim. The wall's position beneath the former holy center sharpens it. Centuries of mourning and prayer harden it further. Remove any one of those, and the explanation thins. Keep all three in view, and the wall begins to make sense, except for how completely reverence has fused them. Until surviving precinct, nearest approach, and accumulated devotion can no longer be cleanly separated on the stone face itself.